Javier, me sale un mensaje. Dice que estoy en una sesión de práctica, iniciar seminario web. No tocamos nada, ¿no?
No. Ah, ok, no, eso no.
Ok.
Me dicen porque si le da clic, inicia el seminario y entran todos.
Ok.
Tiene todo el control, doctor.
Doctora Gil, no travesé, diríamos en mi pueblo, ¿verdad? Quédese quietica.
Tranquilita.
Está bien.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes, Claudio, ¿cómo estás?
Muy bien, ¿ustedes?
Muy bien.
El hospedador no me deja encender el video.
Ah, ok. Enseguida lo activamos, doctor. Bienvenido.
Muchas gracias.
Ya debe tener acceso. Lo vemos perfectamente. Bienvenido.
Muchas gracias. Doctora Daisy, un abrazo enorme a la distancia.
Igualmente, muchas gracias.
Sí. Ujú. Perfecto. Bueno, estamos haciendo pruebas en este momento. Sean todos bienvenidos. Prueba de sonido para asegurarnos que no hay problemas de sonido. ¿Todo bien? Perfecto.
Doctora Graciela Gil,
Cuéntemelo.
¿cómo es el orden de las presentaciones?
El doctor Javier García tiene esa coordinación y le va a dar lectura luego de la doctora Daisy Corrales, el doctor Javier García. Yo prácticamente motivo el objetivo de la participación de ustedes y en el orden que estamos, el doctor va a leer la hoja de vida de cada uno de ustedes. Es así, doctor, ¿no?
Iniciaremos con usted, doctor San Juan. Posteriormente con el doctor Juan José Escobar, a quien estamos esperando. En caso de que no se conecte, pasaríamos entonces con la doctora García y cerraríamos con el doctor Francis Zúñiga. Posteriormente tendremos una sesión de preguntas y respuestas y cerrará la actividad el día de hoy con nosotros la doctora Irma Juárez, de aquí del CIES.
Muchas gracias.
Sí, usted, doctor.
Entonces, para mi presentación, ustedes me autorizan a poner la placa
Así
cuando
es.
me toque.
Sí, de acuerdo. Y
Muchas
en
gracias.
caso de que tengamos algún problema, ya nos compartió usted la presentación, podríamos
es.
proyectarla desde aquí también.
Muy amable.
Sí, gracias, doctor.
Doctor, como somos muy puntuales, si el licenciado Juan José no ingresa dentro de o 5 minutos antes, vamos a iniciar la actividad. Creo que los compañeros acá tienen suficiente material para llenar el espacio.
De acuerdo, doctor.
Son 20 minutos, ¿no, Graciela?
Así es, a raja tabla.
Bueno,
No, el doctor Javier García es un poquito más flexible y les avisa.
sabes que en Argentina 20 minutos son...
¿Son qué, doctor?
Que son,
En Argentina 20 minutos son 30, 40 minutos.
Ah, ya veo.
Es la tolerancia para llegar tarde.
De
La-
acuerdo.
la ventaja es que tú eres muy elocuente y mantienes a todo tu gente pegada. A ver qué va a decir
No,
Claudio.
no. Me estás tratando de viejo. No.
Lo eres,
Ya
Claudio.
conozco sus
Claudio, ya estamos
adjetivos.
cerrando pauta. Claudia.
Conozco sus adjetivos, sí.
No, Francis, no hable, que te veo la cara, Francis. Qué bueno que tiene el micrófono apagado, Francis. No lo escuchamos nada. Francis, tienes el micrófono apagado.
Pero es muy elocuente con los gestos, igual.
Sí.
Y eso que tiene el cabello sin canas, por el momento.
Minutos. Como nos decía...
Viste, Francis, fuiste muy elocuente con tu gesto, te interpretamos muy bien, no te escuchamos nada. Pero mira, te entendimos perfectamente.
Me declaro inocente de todas esas cosas. A la pobre doctora García le están regañando desde hace rato, doctor San Juan, por los 20 minutos. Nosotros incluso en nuestro código de procedimientos civiles tenemos lo que se denominan, vamos más allá que los argentinos, los 15 minutos de ley. El juez tiene que esperar después de la hora en punto 15 minutos para iniciar la audiencia.
Exacto.
O sea, eso es lo que se llama es formalizar en una ley el que la gente llegue tarde.
Claro, acá le llaman primer llamado y segundo llamado a audiencia.
Ajá.
Sí.
Y en el primero nunca hay nadie, por cierto, ni el juez ha llegado.
No. Los testigos.
Así
Los
es.
testigos están siempre puntuales porque lo amenazan con que lo lleva la fuerza pública.
Pues vamos a hacer eso. Si no ha llegado, bueno, ya no llegó el licenciado Juan José, podríamos extendernos un poquito más. Yo les avisaría unos minutos antes de los 30 minutos si es que tienen un poco más de material. ¿De acuerdo? Así es que
Totalmente de acuerdo.
lo tomamos con calma.
Muchas gracias.
Sí, a ustedes. Estamos a 4 minutos, ¿verdad? De iniciar. Okay. Perfecto.
Iniciamos con 5 minutos de cortinilla y arrancamos.
Ok. Tendremos 5 minutos de cortinilla para que se vayan integrando la audiencia y posteriormente iniciamos. Ok.
Perfecto.
Mírala ahí. Puedes hablar con ella. Con la cámara. Ay, sí me veo. Sí te ves, si te pegas acá. Sí. Ahí. Hola, Daisy, ¿cómo estás? Hola a todos. Leticia Martínez.
Hola.
¿Cómo estás, Francis?
Hola,
Muy
hola.
bien, vos, ¿cómo te va? Qué gusto saludarte.
Sí, te escuchan. Ok.
Sí, sí la escuché,
Que les vaya muy
gracias.
bien.
Igual, gracias.
Sí, un buen tema.
Gracias.
Yo voy a estar del otro lado.
Está
Cuídense.
bien.
Adiós.
Dios.
Yo no escuché nada. ¿Tú se escuchas? Vale.
Hay que iniciar un botón que dice iniciar seminario web.
Ah, no, ese no,
No
doctor.
te atrevas, Claudio, a tocar eso.
Estamos,
Entra todo el mundo.
Mirá cómo lo toco. Mirá cómo lo toco.
No lo toques, Claudio, te conozco.
Ah. Bueno, me voy a enmudecer.
detuvo.
Muy buenas tardes. Sean todos y todas
Good
bienvenidos.
afternoon. Please be welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our last webinar of the year at the Labor Commission. And welcome to this dialogue with leaders in labor for the prevention of COVID. I'm going to welcome Daisy Corrales, Dr. Daisy Corrales, our director at CS. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, in the main chat panel and everyone joining in to this exchange of knowledge. As the doctor mentioned, this is the last activity related to webinars, and we have the important topics of dialogue with leaders and regional associations on health, security, and labor during the intervention of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that labor has become relevant during the pandemic as many other topics, and it has played an important role in everything related to control and mitigation of the pandemic, and also the economic recovery. We're present in all scenarios, and here at the conference, we have been working tirelessly, especially with the Labor Risk Commission. Dr. Graciela Islas has been a fearless leader in the conference to promote knowledge, as well as you who have helped us develop this topic at the conference. And because of our request from the Labor Risk Commission, we began a project for a diploma course that started recently for labor health, and this is the largest diploma course that is being taught this year with a participation of more than 200 people who are going to be trained. And in this regard, we have discussed many interesting topics because originally a lot of the theory on labor risk is based on the labor environment and the risks that the worker faces in that work environment. However, I think that one of the important lessons that has been taught to us by the pandemic is that everyone, regardless of whether we're in the work environment or not, we all respond differently to the pandemic. And this is according to our life. Therefore, added to labor risks are family risks, collective risks, and of course, labor risks. And the person who already has a baggage when he or she arrives to the work environment. So it's not the same to have a healthy worker facing the risks related to ergonomics and other aspects of the work, but also the baggage of sickness related to genetics. That is going to define a possible different response. That is why we are concerned to take into account while discussing work risk, the prevention of not just work risk in the work environment, but also the family, collective, and other risks that people face in their everyday life. Taking this into account, everything based on new experiences has proposed this holistic approach that moves around in different scenarios, and among those we find the work scenario. Something that has become relevant is the investment that countries do depending on the economic situation on prevention. It is also important because of this to analyze and reframe all this not as an expense, but as an investment of countries in maintaining their workforce healthy. So I welcome and I thank all panel members. We have today the participation of Dr. Graciela Gil Montalvo. Well, it seems where we have some problems. We have Dr. Juan Jose Escobar from the Latin American Association for Social Security in Peru, Dr. Mercedes Garcia from the Superintendent on Social Security and the Ibero-American Commission in Costa Rica. And we also have the participation of Dr. Irma Juarez, who is the academic coordinator.
Tuvimos ahí un pequeño problema de conexión con la
We're experiencing some connecting issues with the doctor. We have stopped hearing her, but we'll pick this up in a few minutes. Oh, she's back. Go ahead. We were talking about the objectives of this activity, and I think that the connection was lost for a few moments. Well, we need to talk about national policy on health, safety protocols in workspaces that will depend on the investment carried out by countries and institutions, work risks that are emerging and urgent, which are ever changing and where we face different risks, risk assessment and health surveillance. Another objective is to talk about COVID-19 and the legal aspects of social protection and work risks, which derive in an important topic that has been analyzed in the conference, which is the topic of remote work. So welcome everyone. We hope to learn a lot this morning, as always, from the experts and the participations that we have in this webinar. Thank you very much. Welcome. Thank you, Doctor, for your words. I will now give the floor to Dr. Graciela Gil Montalvo, which, as Dr. Daisy Corrales mentioned, is our chairperson at the Inter-American Commission on Work Risk Prevention. I am also very pleased to have close friends of our Inter-American Center for Social Security Studies who will share their knowledge on work risks and health. So I will now read a brief summary of Dr. Hill. Dr. Hill is the chief of work risk at the superintendent in the Dominican Republic, and as it was mentioned, she is the chairperson of the Inter-American Commission on Work Risk Prevention. She is the director of the Work Health Commission at the Dominican Republic, and she coordinates works in occupational epidemiology. She has a master's in public health, master's in work risk prevention, safety and industrial health. She has a master's in management of social security systems and occupational health, social security benefits, and she teaches social security. So I now give the floor to our chairperson, Dr. Hill. Good morning, everyone. The Inter-American Commission on Work Risk Prevention thanks the Inter-American Center for Social Security Studies and its director, Dr. Daisy Corrales, and Gabriel Garcia, our advisor, for the support to this special initiative where we will hear from leaders on work health in the Americas. Our region has noteworthy professionals and work health associations, and the commission invites everyone for future collaborations to widen the knowledge from other countries. Because in the COVID-19 pandemic, we have heard policymakers on markets and economics and social security systems and collective health and international authorities. And that is why we are now pleased to hear the perspective of interventionists who lead the interventions on work risk prevention, which include the analysis of work risk prevention programs, setting new measures to surveil work health, and the avoidance of contagions derived from this learning from the pandemic, the promotion of health in workspaces, the focus of COVID-19 in many countries and other populations, as well as the practices derived from the response that has an impact in the system and the management of companies to recover the economy, and how the workforce health impacts the health of companies. Preventionists have played an important role in maintaining these essential economic activities, as well as the non-essential activities during the pandemic, and preparing the workspaces during the reopening process of companies and measures in workspaces. Now, with a more comprehensive focus, taking into consideration workers' health and their individuality, all preventionists now know that a risk assessment now has changed and considers personal aspects of workers. Within the OPS strategic plan, we now consider workspaces as the ideal place to promote health, a comprehensive health, because the business sector is also being transformed and understands as economic success workers' health. So that is why we now talk about a comprehensive, sustainable management, business well-being, and workers' well-being. Each country has had its own experience, but we cannot deny that today these work health professionals have gained much more relevance, and without a doubt, they will have to face the emerging risks because of these new ways of working and the development of ITs. The demand of these professionals will lead countries to review academic offerings, especially in ergonomics and psychopsychology, and also in implementing new measures for hygiene and psychology. But let's invite these professionals from Argentina, Peru, Costa Rica, and the Dominican Republic to tell us their experience and the aspects of their practice. But first, we thank all the participants. The Inter-American Commission on Work Risk Prevention wishes you a very fruitful day. Dr. Javier Garcia, please introduce our guests. Thank you very much, Doctor, for your words on the relevance of the topics that we'll be discussing this afternoon with our presenters. Before we introduce our first speaker, I would like to say that we're reading your questions in the chat. At the end of the presentation of each one of our speakers, we will be reading your questions so the speakers can answer them. So our first speaker is Dr. Claudio San Juan. He's a member of the Euro Latin American Network on Analysis and Unionization, coordinator of the Work Health Access. He's a senior preventionist at the Labor Ministry in Argentina since 2001. He has a degree in hygiene and work health by the Morón University, magister in work relations by the National University, February 3rd, specialist in the work health, accredited by ASET, magister in human rights, state and society by the February 3rd National University. He has a certification by academia on the compliance of ILO measures, and he teaches professionalizing practice in the course for the work health degree in the February 3rd University, as well as in the Informatics and Special Technologies University. And he's also teaches work health. Dr. Carlos San Juan is a very active collaborator of our American Commission on Work Risk Prevention since 2005. So it's a pleasure to have him with us today. Doctor, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation that you have given me. I am honored. I get to share a topic that we began a year ago. I'm going to present a comparative study on the legislation of remote work in countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And to give continuity to the study, what I propose is to see how we have applied these legal aspects on the risks of remote work. As it was also mentioned, I would like to mention the aspects that are going to be discussed today in these 20 minutes that I get to present. As the presenter mentioned, I would like to also talk about the participation of workers as when I started participating in Capri in 2005. This is the second version of this lecture because of the mixed labor legislation project in Argentina. I would like to say this just so you know what is our journey here in the south of the continent. But as we have said in other times, to talk about remote work, we need to define it. This is a definition from the ILO, and it comes from 2019. It says that both remote work and mobile work, which are synonymous at times, is work that is aided by the use of technologies, TICs, and it is basically developed in a different place other than the employer's facilities. So, from this definition, we differentiate ourselves from other terms, which is remote work, uh, housework, different from work that is done in the employer's facilities and branches. Telework and teleworkers reach an agreement with employers. And having said this, we're going to review the 3 generations of telework. We have colleagues from ILO, and these generations grow and change as information technologies change. The first generation from Jack Nemes is when the office can only be installed because of the characteristics of the work with PCs at home. The second generation relates to the surgence of laptops that allows us to work in any other places where we have connectivities with TICs, but we don't use our home or any other place. And the third generation is the virtual office, aided by the appearance of smartphones and the cloud. Now, these colleagues define these generations very accurately. I think that time will tell us if we're right, if there is a possible 4th generation of telework that came about because of the challenges of this pandemic, which is the forced telework. Because due to this pandemic, we had to set aside the telework basic principles. Another teaching from the pandemic that we mentioned last year is this pyramid for risk control. In the matter of safety and health, it has been executed very few times to get rid of the risk in telework. The fact that workers were able to stay at home to not get infected by COVID-19 forced us to follow these teachings from this pyramid. Obviously, as we go down the pyramid, the level of protection and prevention becomes more complex. And that is why we reach the base of the pyramid, which is the workers in maintenance that were not able to do telework, and they were down there in the fighting. So we focus on personal protection, the use of gloves, face coverings, etc. This is a great teaching from the pandemic that needs to be reviewed in the future, because always, unfortunately, when we want to control one risk, we start from the end, which is giving workers personal protection equipment without really minimizing the risks. What I would like to share from the technical point of view
are the 4 intervention areas tool that have been usually used from the 1970s, as for example, health and security. And then it was added ergonomics and finally psychosociology. So we changed the focus of technical action that led us to a new dynamic without forgetting the social and psycho elements in the work. From this point of view, these fields of technical intervention outstand three basic actions that complement each other, and they also interrelate. For example, the standards action. This is fixing the rules of work and the rules of teleworking and other subjects. The formation action, that are the stakeholders and the working sector and the entrepreneurs needs to understand the rules of the game, and then the legal or fiscalization to see that all these rules have been complied with. Following up the cycle and that is given by Eduardo, that is a Colombian colleague, said something that we needed to face during the pandemic, to some failures in the teleworking system. Because, for example, people needed to have telecommunication system in IT systems that many times the property of the worker, both male and female, were not available because the workers were not foreseeing the necessary equipment for this kind of situation, and also the generation of devices to be used during work. At least in Argentina, we have seen a great range of devices, of smartphones. Not everybody has portable laptops at home. So by using these smart telephones, led us to also other challenges in the visual and adaptation factors. For example, there were teleworkers that develop applications in order to continue with their own businesses. And another point was the security of the information they were sharing. From this teleworking cycle comes the sequence of doing a teleworking in a health and secure environment. First of all, we need to make a difference. We need to talk about the pre and post pandemic, because during the pandemic, we couldn't just sit and think if we were having the working area and the equipment, because not all the workers had available a desk or a library. Many males and females needed to work from the kitchen, from the dining hall, from the living room, and many times to share the equipment at home with children in order for the children make the homeschool task. So in order to have the equipment, we need to check the working service condition that is the subject of our organization. In these different sectors, we can take them from the self-proving through a manual, as it has been developed before the pandemic, and with other organizations with whom I've been working, or through an online service that we have had with health professionals. Once that this is solved, and then we need to go to the third step, plan the tasks. All these, the tasks that have been given to us, have an objective, a productivity level that at the end of our day work need to be complied with. So from that, it is very important to go to the fourth step, that is schedule, and think which will be the active process how will be programmed in order to preserve our psychophysical health. And this process is not just to stop the work for a nap. No, it's just to go and do other activity, look for papers, as point 5 says, call the authorities or call the colleagues in order not to feel isolated. Another topic that we have discovered by comparing other legislation at national level is availability of the working population to do the task at home. Especially for taking care of children or senior people, or of ill people, or of disabled people. And then the Argentinian legislation demands the employers to be flexible in the work schedule in order to allow people to be available to do this kind of jobs. And in the previous to last point, reaching the end of the day work, we need to see if we are complying with the objectives entrusted to us. And if not, see how we're going to solve those points. Another point that appeared before the pandemic, but also emphasized more during the pandemic, is the violence and work harassment at home. For example, ILO as gave some tools in order to prevent violent situations at home and promote teleworking area free of violence, and also to, if we go physically to the work, we need to be protected. And if we are subject of harassment, we need to denounce it before the authorities. Finally, and this has led us to the digital disconnection. This happens when, irrespective of who is implementing the working tools, at the end of the day work, the person needs to have the right to disconnect. Well, there are some exceptions. For example, in Argentina, there are major forces that demand people to continue connected. For example, the employer invites the employee to continue working in extraordinary hours. Why? In order to face a major force situation, and there are no enough workers to face these extra hours. So for us, this is the sequence of organizing our teleworking. Maybe I had skipped a point, but basically we need to have these 9 points. Based on these new didactic processes, or in this intervention process, there is something new in the challenge of the pandemic, all the social risks. Here, what I will try to share is what I have faced before, during, and after the pandemic. And in order to detect and prevent psychosocial risks at work, what is our reference framework? Before the pandemic, we have the ILO encyclopedia in 2018 that talk about stress factors connected to teleworking. Also, the Industrial Observatory of Telecommunications in Spain that gave us a series of elements in order to manage psychosocial risks. As I was telling you, and based on that, we have the Convention 190. And also CIS and ILO and talk about the teleworking conditions during pandemic situations. In order to talk about this challenge, we are going to mention what is the definition of work psychosocial risks based on the definition of ILO and WHO definition. What does this definition says? Psychosocial factors are based on interactions coming from the work environment and from the work satisfaction and conditions of the organizations on one side. On the other side, it is based on the capacities and expectations of the worker and of the culture and habits and on the personal conditions outside work. Everything can influence and impact on health, either on the performance at work or in the satisfaction and rewards from work. Well, I was telling you by Tesla. It says that during the pandemic, the work risks are enforced in teleworking. Well, it has a normal work environment, but we have certain peculiar stress. For example, what is the peculiar situation of teleworking situation at home? As I was telling you, is the teleworking place. If we are having all the security conditions, like power connection, ergonomics, ventilation, and conditioning, and the same as in the office. Do we have them at home? But there is another element that we don't have in the office, the sensation of isolation. And so and these are the first publication of ILO, the 128 publication about teleworking. And well, the teleworkers, both male and female, need to be invited by other activities promoted by the employer, and that he will provide other electronic means, as for example, the teleconference, to have a meeting with the other colleagues. During the pandemic, the industrial observatories of Spain telecommunications developed a guideline defining the causes, consequences, and preventive measures to prevent psychosocial risks, as for example, the isolation feeling, how to reduce it, pathological factors, as for example, the stress or other elements. How can they be reduced? And finally, and based about cyberbullying, there is a definition contained in Article 3rd of the Convention. It says, it is a situation happening during work, in relation to work, or as a result of the work, and also in the framework of telecommunications that are interrelated with work or are done by IT systems or by communication systems. That means the employer needs to respect the contract of workers, as we said, and by propitiating an environment free of harassment and violence, and also needs to see the digital connection and needs to respect the employer, the personal life of the workers, and control systems need to safeguard the intimacy and the privacy of the home and lives of workers. During the pandemic situation, which are the problems in the world in the psychosocial risks? Well, in the Article 3rd, it says addiction to technology and overburden of work, increase in fatigue, irritability, and the incapacity to disconnect from the electronic means, and the increase of alcohol and other drugs abuse. In that increases negative feelings and diminishes performance and increases violence and aggression. And at the end, the prolonged isolation and sitting position, not moving, and increases health problems, increases obesity, and muscular and physical elements. That's why it is necessary to have active pauses. Another interesting publication of ILO, it talks about the psychosocial factor management and COVID in general guidelines, not only on teleworking. And here, as you can see, it's a list of chapters and that talk about all the measures that I have talked about. And I put it as a list in order for you to remember which are the measures to be taken. What has happened also during the pandemic? During the pandemic, we had an ISO emergency standard, as for example, 4025 standard that are guidelines for the secure work during the pandemic of COVID. This standard is not certifiable because it only sets some conditions. It talks about conditions at home and the elements necessary for well-being and psychophysical conditions. In order to reduce the psychological stress at home, well, if we don't do it, it can increase the psychosocial factors, and from there, it can cause other impacts. What are we expecting after the pandemic in order to promote in the American society in the prevention of work risks? Well, first, Spain, through by law, established some situations connected to teleworking and evaluation of risk. The new standards 4,403 start 25,003, sorry, was started before the pandemic and establishes guidelines for the prevention of psychosocial risks. But there is a factor pending in that standard, that is the evaluation. And at the end, there is another interesting part that represents a lot of challenge, that is the preparation of methods for the prevention of psychosocial stresses. So what is being given by this Spanish law, and besides the risk prevention? It says it needs to be taken into account the psychosocial, ergonomic, and administrative conditions, the availability timing, the availability of pauses, and the availability of being disconnected during the day work. These are the basic points stated by law, and that until now it has not been implemented as law. But we need to think about it as a process. And finally, from this bibliography, there are two reports discussing the last G20 summit in Italy that are the political conditions to improve remote scenarios, including the digital platforms, that is another challenge facing by all the countries, and some guidelines of teleworking during the pandemic and after the pandemic of COVID. And see this reports, and I recommend it, the standard study elaborated by the colleagues of CS on psychosocial risks in the work, its prevention and solution. And also there is another report on teleworking and impacts left by the pandemic and challenges. With this bibliography, I appreciate your attention. And well, I think that you can also give me your comments or questions. And please give them to me in order for me to answer. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Doctor. We thank you for the perspective shared on teleworking as an essential tool to contain the health emergency, in this case for COVID-19, by eliminating the contagious points, but also by offering all these considerations on the modality to guarantee the security and physical and psychosocial health of teleworkers. Thank you very much for your lecture. Now we are going to give the floor to the next speaker. I want to tell you that we are reading on the chat your regards and comments. And this chat makes them a very interactive dialogue tool. This webinar, of course, will be shared later on. And we will be uploading it to the microsite of the American Commission of Work Risk Prevention. The link will be shared in the chat, and the activity will be uploaded in the section of extension. And this section is at the bottom of the main page. So in few more seconds, I will be sharing with you this link during in the chat. They are asking about if I'm going to share the presentations of the speakers. Later on, I will tell you that. I will talk with the speakers, and if they agree to share their lectures, of course, we will be uploading them in that section. So now, let's listen our next speaker, Dr. Mercedes Garcia Mendez. She, and I will read her bio. She's a PhD in medicine from the Tech University and specializing in work health, and has a master's on prevention of health risks and social management, and also a master's in body damage and a master's in work health. And she has a master's in social security, and she has been certified by WHO and PAHO by SIC Facilitator, that is the classification for moderating disabilities and health. And she's a professor of health work in the Universidad Santo Domingo, and teaches on the risk prevention health in the master's degree of ITEC, and also gives classes on master's degree in the University Pontificia Católica Madre. And she's a co-author of vaccination guideline developed by the Caribbean and Central American Health Commission. And she has been president of the Dominican Occupational and Health Risks Association. And she coordinates the Latin American Association for Hygiene and Work Occupational Health, and also in the Central American Association of Work and Health Occupation Health. And she's a member of ICO, and she's a founder member of the Dominican Association of Work Prevention Risks. And she was also a vice chairwoman of this society from 2004 to 8. And she's a member of the Association of Occupational Health since 2006, and she is a director on labor risk insurance in the Superintendence of Health and Labor Risk, where she has prepared guidelines and topics to prevent work risk for the social system in Americas. It's a pleasure to listen to you. I give you the floor. Good afternoon to everybody. It's a great pleasure to convey you my greetings. Well, here is morning, but in other places it's afternoon or evening. It's a pleasure to share this space with you. And I thank you, the Inter-American Conference of Social Protection for the invitation. And we are here to talk about our experience as a country in this topic of the pandemic COVID-19. Let me share with you my screen with all of you. Give me a minute, please.
Doctora García. Parece que
no le escucho. ¿Pueden ver la pantalla?
Can you see my screen? Yes, perfectly well. We were listening to a horrible noise, doctor, while you were speaking, but I think it's fixed. Oh no, now again it came the sound. Are you listening better? No, we continue to hear a horrible noise. There was just a few seconds that this noise disappeared. Are you listening better? No, We're still continuing to listen reverberance. Perfect. Everything is fixed now. Doctor, you have muted your microphone. Can you open it? Can you turn it on? You still have your mic muted. Can you turn it on, please? Yes. Are you listening better or the noise continues? Yes, we still continue to listen the noise.
Bien, estamos tratando de solucionar este.
We are trying to fix this technical issue.
Adelante, doctora.
Se mantiene el ruido. Estamos
Yeah. I will turn off the air conditioning. That's why maybe it's producing the noise. I will turn it off in order to start my speech.
Por lo pronto, doctora, si gusta, podemos iniciar, si la podemos escuchar.
Okay, we can listen to you, doctor. We have just as a back, we have this noise at the back, so please, you can start. Unless you want to wait a couple of minutes. Now we are listening you correctly. Okay. We can start, and I will be speaking at a high volume in order for you to listen me better. As we all know, in January of 2020, the World Health Organization declares the emergency of international relevance in the coronavirus sprout. And we started to have an emergency response plan in front of this plan. The first case detected in the country was on March 2020. It was an imported case detected on a tourist that had just arrived from Italy 2 weeks after we registered the first death caused by coronavirus. And we estimated that as from this first case reported and detected, the propagation of the virus started in the country. As from this situation, the Dominican country faces this situation, and the first decision of the government was to implement institutional and constitutional measures to respond quickly before the pandemic. In March 2019, the country is declared under emergency decree, decree 134-20, where the government restricted transit and the associations and meetings in order to guarantee that all health centers be supplied with all the instruments and means to help on the health of people, and included to receive infected people with COVID-19. There were measures to support the economic sectors in an emergency to protect employment and revenues of workers. Other kind of measures implemented by the government was the implementation of health protocols
for the access to the country. where we took the temperature of people and quarantined all passengers coming from other countries. We suspended flights from Europe and China outside of South America, really, and we applied mandatory quarantine to those passengers, especially the passengers who had visited these other places in the past 2 weeks. We banned the arrival of cruise ships to Latin American ports, and we implemented border security. We installed sanitary control units in borders. We suspended classes, and we did everything virtually. We called off events, and we established from the afternoon to 7 a.m. and the mandatory use of face masks was implemented. Now, this caused a negative effect on the income of families, and that's why the state implemented different measures in order to help the income of the population. In this sense, with all the measures taken by the Dominican Republic, they also created the creation of the unemployment support in order to give resources to workers and complement the negative effects of the pandemic. This fund for employment support, known as FASE, had two phases. The first one was for workers who were fired and whose companies closed. These companies had to provide donations to the Secretary of Finance, and the fund for income solidarity had to be managed by the Secretary of Labor. The monthly income received by the worker was 5,000 pesos, which represented 70% of the salary of the worker, 5,000 Dominican pesos, and it could never surpass 8,500 pesos. The salary of that worker had to be assumed by companies according to their possibilities. In phase two, we comprised manufacturing companies and small and medium businesses who had the authorization from the labor ministry to keep operating during the state of emergency. In this phase, the state provided 5,000 Dominican pesos and the employer paid the remaining amount to fulfill the salary of the workers, with the commitment that the employer had to pay all the obligations to the treasury as well as taxes. In order to have access to phase two, employers could not suspend any of the workers, and if they fired one, they automatically were taken out of that program. In phase two, which you can see in pink in the slide showing, this phase included, in parallel, all the companies that, while they closed, kept paying the salary of the workers, also complying with all their obligations and taxes. This plan was thought for 60 days, but it was increased for 30 more days. Among the restrictions caused by the state of emergency that impacted in the national productive sector, causing thousands of losses of jobs, the Ministry of Labor asked the employers to increase telework. And through Resolution 60, 2020, it banned the creation of new jobs for public government workers, and these are some of the measures that were taken by the Dominican government. Everything related to the measures employed by the government, and among all these measures in the state of emergency, it was established that in order to take care of the workers above 60 years of age who had to be isolated, they had to be isolated or kept at home for work. Now, for the economic reactivation, this measure started in March 19th. In phase one, we included micro businesses up to 10 employees who could reincorporate themselves, and companies with 10 employees could have 50% of their employees work. Now, larger companies could only use 25% of their workers. Now, doctors' offices and hairdressers had to go back to work, but they had to take health measures. Other companies could have 100% of their workforce work, and small companies could incorporate up to 25% of their workers, while large companies could operate with 50% of their workers. In phase two, malls were opened and it was allowed to use private ride-sharing companies. Now, phase three was delayed because phase two saw an increase in COVID cases. When phase three began, small and medium businesses up to 50 employees could work at 100% capacity, while companies that surpassed 50 employees could only work with 75% of their workforce. In this phase, religious services were started again 3 times a week. In phase four, all companies could have 100% of their workforce reactivated. We reactivated tourism, opening hotels and airports, as well as gyms and restaurants. From this, we can see that there was an impact in the workforce indicators. According to the continuous surveys of the Central Bank of the Dominican Republic, in the first quarter of 2020, we had a formal sector amounting to 51%. And in the third quarter of this year, this formal market maintained 85% of occupied population, while the informal sector increased in the first quarter of 2021 because of the incidence of COVID cases. We see here that when we established the state of emergency in March of 2020, workers and companies had a downward curve, and we see the amount of workers, around 500,000 employees were left out of a job. And so we see how the curve between April and May has a downward trend. However, by June and July, while implementing the economic reactivation phases, this behavior has an upward trend. And by December of 2020, the numbers of employees and companies were almost the same as in the first quarter of 2020. This was because of the economic reactivation that was implemented continuously with phases. This included, as part of the actions of the state and the recommendations from the CDC, OSHA, and the European Union. The coordinating unit at the president's office issued guidelines for health and work in agricultural work and presented what we know as the generalized protocol for reactivation of work. This protocol has measures that, among which we find the participation of employees. We have preventive measures, the inclusion of emerging risks in health and work plans, risk assessments by work position. We established the safety, cleaning, disinfection periods, handling of disinfectants and PPE, the health and safety of workers, measures such as the taking of temperature and the protection of employees impacted by COVID who had to be quarantined because of their infection. We established work flexibility, and we also include security for the implementation of these measures in workspaces. These sector protocol authorized companies to do PCR tests as long as they were accepted by the FDA, and setting up spaces for these tests. The country also has specific protocols, such as the health sector, where we established general guidelines for the normalization of health services during the pandemic. In the framework of health, all these guidelines set the rules and regulations that have to be followed by institutions and companies, both private and public. And all these guidelines are adaptations of the ones recommended by the World Health Organization. I invite you to visit the link I shared in order to find more information. We will now talk about COVID as a work disease. COVID as a work disease was defined in May when, based on the open list of work diseases, it was recommended to consider SARS-2 COVID disease as a work disease. In the Dominican system, this includes doctors, nurses, orderlies. Now, to diagnose We also established in the legal framework a note that served as a guide to classify the disease as a professional disease or professional in origin. And that is when the Work Risk Commission and its technical note 3 said that for the diagnosis, it had to be taken into consideration whether the worker was active and affiliated to the system at the time of the diagnosis. The notification had to be done by the employer or representative to the risk prevention sector and present the will verify and document the exposition to the risk at the work space to have a positive PCR test and the scope for this insurance from these criteria we established that these benefits afforded to workers because of work accidents or work diseases. After that moment, all expenses because of health expenses was going to include COVID as a professional disease. We also have to take into consideration that in the notification of work accidents and professional diseases in previous years, these reports were very different in this context because work accidents in 2020 decreased, accident rates decreased to 40%. However, the impact of claims because of work diseases and biological risk represented 15% of contingencies qualified as work originated, while before it was only 1%. This has been the behavior since March of last year. At the end of the year, we received notifications amounting to 5,000 notifications considering COVID as a professional disease. And out of those 55,000, we acknowledged most as professional in origin. In this year, by June of this year, we had 4,300 claims, out of which 1,200 were declined and the rest was acknowledged and approved. We need to stress this because before, professional diseases didn't amount to 1% of work contingencies acknowledged in this. Because of telework and because of the pandemic, we established regulations related to the modalities of telework, both in the public and private sectors. The work ministry that regulates work relations for the private sector issued the 2020 resolution for telework as a special modality of work, and the public administration ministry that governs work relations in the public sector also submitted resolution 130 where it establishes the telework guidelines. These resolutions, we can stress that The application of telework is voluntary and is conditioned to a written agreement between the parties, creating a new contract or amending the existing contract where we need to detail the tasks that are going to be carried out, the conditions in which telework is going to be carried out, the implementation period, whether it is for a specific term, a defined term, where is that telework going to be carried out. We also need to establish during that the remuneration and the rest hours. We need to point out that within the telework guidelines for public administration and its ministry, they considered four modalities for telework: telework as a whole, partial telework, temporary telework, and mobile telework. When we talk about full telework, we mean the work that is going to be totally done remotely and permanently as telework. The one that is partial is when the work is going to alternate between in-person and telework. And the temporary telework is when assigned tasks are done in telework, and when mobile telework, we mean when the tasks done by that worker are outside of the office or in the field, or in case the worker needs to be in constant movement. Because of the pandemic, other sectors have shown pronouncements about telework. The judicial branch established that the references and the guidelines for judges or legal workers to work remotely, ensuring the principle of continuity of the state. Other offices or agencies that submitted guidelines for telework was the Presidential Office for Information Technologies and Communication Technologies that included a concept framework of telework and a motivation for government agencies to develop telework positions. In 2020, in January 2020, the legislative power submitted a law for telework that is pending of publication to be enacted in the country. Other instances or agencies for technical work was the Dominican Association of Work Risk, which issued a guideline in order to aid the Dominican population. It issued the guide for good practices for the construction industry. Another initiative was to include the recommendations, the technical recommendations for business people because of the pandemic, because the disinfection tunnels were one of the measures that were initially adopted. This good practice guide includes recommendations for health and safety in order to establish safe workplaces during the COVID-19 pandemic. In February of this year, the government started the program called Vacúnate RB, starting the first phase with healthcare professionals who were working directly with COVID-19 cases. And then it went to inoculate the rest of the healthcare personnel. Phase 1C included the vaccination of senior citizens above 70 years of age, and we also included teachers for elementary school and secondary education. Phase 1B included senior citizens above 60 years, the armed forces, and we also vaccinated the rest of the education personnel that was not vaccinated in phase 1C. The second stage that had two stages, A and B, started in May, where we vaccinated personnel between 50 and 60 years old with comorbidities. And the second phase, B, included the population between 50 and 59 years of age. Phase 3 started May 10th, where we took the general population above 18 years to 49 years. First, with the vaccination of people with comorbidities, and then the rest of the population who did not have comorbidities. At present, this vaccination program shows the vaccination, the fully vaccination of 5.5 million people of Dominicans. The second dose was 5.5 million doses for the people. This year, October 8th, the health ministry issued new health measures, and it established that after 12 years of years, people will not be able to attend schools or public spaces without their vaccination card or showing a negative PCR test. This measure was also adopted in workspaces. We also made the use of face masks and hand washing as mandatory, and only 75% of the total capability of public spaces can be used. Finally, the COVID-19 pandemic has had challenges for public health and the provision of health services around the world. The Dominican Republic has not been the exception, which has made it necessary to take decisions at the government level in a sustained way to guarantee the health of the entire population. Prevention measures, the application of protocols in workplaces have allowed the management and control of this pandemic. In our country, the pandemic has boosted the development of a preventive culture in companies, which is shown by the creation of protocols that back the prevention measures from the government. In the construction sector, the education sector, the tourism sector, the creation of virtual education systems and within companies, we acknowledge that telework is not applicable to all productive activities, which makes more vulnerable all those workers that have to be going in person to their workplaces. That's why the prevention and control measures have to be paramount in order to avoid new infections. The pandemic crisis has created a lot of issues related to mental health. Increased psychosocial risk created depression, stress because of workloads, restlessness because of fear, and these diseases may last even beyond the pandemic. And that is why it's important to establish activities in the companies that help manage psychosocial risks. Dr. San Juan has stressed the relevance of psychosocial risks, but in order for us to manage psychosocial risks, we need to have activities linked to the work day rest, and as we saw in the previous presentation. So I thank you once more for your attention. Thank you very much. I'm open to answering any question or comment.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for sharing with us all your experience about pandemic management and protocols and guidelines for the safe insertion to productive labors in Dominican Republic, and all the experience of the inclusion practices of COVID-19 in the professional scenario is very important. And the guidelines and recommendations you talk about are very relevant, and the adaptations in different professional sectors, as for example, the teleworking for non-essential tasks, and also the prevention of infection measures that need to be implemented. In teleworking is not necessary, but it needs to be implemented, as for example, in the construction sector. We thank you for your lecture, Doctor. And now I present our next speaker. It's a pleasure to have once again Dr. Francis Zúñiga. And if you allow me, I will read his bio. Dr. Zúñiga is director of Ibero-American Society of Social Security in Costa Rica, OIS, and he is a professor of health policy and it's also in law. And also he has a master's degree in social protection from the University of Madrid, Spain, and has had different positions in the Ministry of Law and Work in Costa Rica. And he has worked as an executive member of BM Vital, that is a complementary retirement funds association in Costa Rica. And he is a judge of the Football Costa Rican Association. He has a PhD on labor law and social security and labor security in the teleworking modality, and it is given by University in Costa Rica. And also he has been a speaker in different national congresses and Ibero-American congresses, and has been an invited professor in many times in the Inter-American Conference of Social Protection in Mexico. And since 2009, he is a director of the Social Protection and Social Security Center in Costa Rica. For us, it's a great pleasure to have you with us, Doctor. I give you the floor. And thank you very much, Mr. Javier. First of all, I want to thank you and also the dear chairwoman of the commission, and Mrs. Montalvo, and also my colleague, Dr. Corrales, and that we were born in the same country, and director of CS. And thank you very much for having invited me to this interesting seminar. I'm going to put aside some points that I prepared because it has been given by Dr. San Juan or Dr. Garcia. But I will emphasize that many of the actions taken in an emergency situation in the American countries and in relation to COVID-19 are very similar. Some of our countries applied recurring measures that adapted to the different needs of each country. But at the end, Based on what Dr. Corrales said and Dr. San Juan said, the vision of labor risks, as we call in Central America, as security and labor risk. Well, the hygiene health at work before the pandemic is totally different after the pandemic. All the elements that Dr. San Juan mentioned in relation to the new illnesses or the new risks that we all face, and based on the IT and the teleworking practices, will imply a very important modality, and institutions, as for example, the CIS and the organization I represent, play an important role because they will implement a more serious process of training the workers and employers. So here I will focus and summarize a little bit the vision of Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a small country and located at the end part of South America. You know, at the second semester of 2021, just a few days ago, we had 5,139,000 inhabitants and about 600 and 700,000 depended on the figures that talk about migrants. We are receiving a lot of migrants, and I will speak about it in relation to COVID-19 practices. In the actions of COVID-19 went from emergency practices of March 2020, when many countries established the emergency decree, for example, Don Carlos Alvarado in Costa Rica, and issue a decree. And until now, it is a decree that prevails in the administrative and legal courts. And they are stating as mandatory for all the health and work institutions the vaccination, especially for public employees, and the obligation of being vaccinated for employers in the private sector. So from the point of view of the basic work prevention measures, we can have different categories. So until now, Costa Rica has had around 560,000 confirmed COVID cases and around 4,400 men and 2,800 women, according to the Ministry of Health, that have died, and from zero number of ages to 103 ages. And some international organizations say that we have the blue areas, and these areas receive many senior people with more than 95 years old, and many reaching the 100 years. And this has generated an important number of senior people. I'm going to share my presentation. Yes, we can see your screen. Oh, but I don't see it. Okay, but we can see it. Okay, now I'm also seeing it. Are you seeing it as a presentation? Yes, as a presentation. Well, here I have an issue in the version of presenting. Well, I'm going to locate this. Costa Rica has faced 10 mortality cases since 19th century. This most serious was between 1851 and 1875. We call it a national campaign, that is a war process between Costa Rica and Nicaragua because they were defending the territories before a North American invasion. And so just imagine that pandemic caused 80,000 more dead. It was the 7% of the population at that time, and the same of other Central American countries since the 70s. We are in an epidemiological transition that has made that many parasitary and infectious diseases reduced from 75% to 5% from 2020, from 1920 to 2000. And of course, the causes of chronic and degenerative causes increased from 8 to 56%. This needs to be remembered when I talk about the location of the country. Before the pandemic, there was several regulations, as in other countries. One was passed since 1982 as a reform of the labor code. All the regulations for the work prevention risk and the work labor law. We created a decentralized entity, and it has played an important role for the work prevention risk and COVID prevention situation. It has three parties formed by employers, workers, and representatives of the public, Costa Rican and Caja, because the Ministry of Labor is also participant there, and the regulations are mandatory. This is an advantage of the implementation of regulations of work and labor hygiene. And also, we had a national plan of labor of occupational health approved since 1998. Costa Rica merged by the Ministry of Labor to the first Ibero-American Labor Association. Before the pandemic, we used to have an action plan of the occupational health since 1919. In the 2020, in the Occupational Congress, discussed that regulation and prepared the following 3 years or 4 years up to 2023 and 24. And we had a specific regulation for teleworking. We had a teleworking regulation of work risks. Our security, social security manages all work risks, accident, professional diseases, and work accidents. Since 2010, it had foresee all the labor accidents while performing the teleworking. And we had a guideline for occupational teleworking system issued in 2018 by the Council of Occupational Teleworking Risks that stated the obligations of employers, workers, and teleworkers in relation to teleworking, and in the definition of the advisable teleworking positions. And that guideline joined to a law that was approved in the Congress, in our Legislative Assembly in 2019. And it is the law that regulates teleworking in such a way that in a certain degree, we were prepared to face this crisis of the pandemic. But it is not so true based on what I'm going to say, because the pandemic generated a worse situation. And as Dr. San Juan said, with the pandemic, we sent the workers home to perform teleworking under unforeseen conditions. And of course, all the health standards approved in 2018, it was the same law that stated to have a teleworking contract. And so especially I am presenting this slide because in the Costa Rican case, and we need to consider this when we talk about COVID, our country has undergone important changes in the productive and laboral structure. The third economic sector, as you can see in the chart, is the one that has grown more in the last 5 years. Economic activities, especially from that sector, meet 68% of the workers, while the primary and secondary sectors cover less population. In the secondary sector, industry and construction prevail. And why? Because one of the sectors that is very important in Costa Rica is tourism, that is here in the tertiary sector. Since 2019, Costa Rica received 139 million tourists that has stayed in the country in an average of 12 days, according to the Ministry of Tourism. When the national emergency was declared and it was taken measures similar to those mentioned by Dr. Garcia, and the lockdown was announced and our borders were closed. And so these workers facing very serious problems and they were jobless. And so tourism not only involves the formal sector as hotels, but also the informal and independent works, as for example, the drivers, carriers, and that transport the workers. All of them lost their jobs. And as based on these, immediate consequences of the pandemic were the following: loss of revenues, loss of serious numbers of jobs in certain activities of economy, and the work was used to lessen the negative impacts in private and public sectors, because in Costa Rica, we also had negative impacts before the pandemic, because there were some workers having teleworking. But from one day to another, people had to go home doing teleworking, and as Dr. San Juan said, under very complicated situations, because there were people that just started to buy the internet system and things like that. Another thing was to be sensitive in labor conditions, for example, in psychomental condition, and there we face the migrant worker condition. We are a country that basically, instead of expelling people, we attract migrants. So our brothers from Nicaragua that are at the north border comes to work in Costa Rica. And also we have other kind of migration that is highly qualified migrants coming from Colombia, and they cross the Darin clog in the jungle between Colombia and Panama. They reach Panama and they start, and I apologize for the term, they continue to increase and increase. Why? Or to get up, because they go to the north and they are not interested to work in our country. They are obsessed to reach North America. Many of our co-citizens continue to have the American dream, and that is a serious problem, because that produces the white human trafficking, drug dealers, health problems, and added to COVID-19, we had a long line of migration coming from Haiti, Africa, and also Venezuela and other countries from South America. So that was another important element in regards to all the actions that we needed to develop to face COVID. And the same as many other countries, the GDP in Costa Rica in 2020 was of less of 4.1%. And if we compare it to the most favorable situations of other countries and in Central American countries. But employment rate suffered a lot, was highly impacted. And we lost around 237,000 jobs. And that according to INEC. And we are recovering right now because they have launched the survey on homes and developing the figures on this aspect. But we need to be clear in the Costa Rica to meet the health ordinary risk problems and accident and professional diseases and everything related also to COVID. It was very, very important, all the functions of the coordination among our institution and the Caja Costarricense and the Ministry of Health that acts as a general policymaker with all the public obligations and of course the social security to issue measures to treat COVID. As Dr. Garcia said, from March 2020, the Insurance National Association admitted the COVID-19 disease as a professional disease. And of course, it was issued an emergency decree. And of course, they emphasized that labor was important and they reduced the day work. In May 2020, a decree was issued to suspend some jobs. Work is regulated in the Constitution, but this decree was a fast action mechanism to be implemented by many employers. The Ministry of Work and Social Security and Ministry of Health issue guidelines to regulate the state institutions during the declaration of emergency. And they establish their works in different steps and accumulative they works for public officers and also implemented in private sectors. So many measures, important measures were taken. The first was the teleworking, especially to all public officials. And there were a lot of public servants, as you can see in the slide. Up to August 24, 2020, were 63,747 people teleworking in the public sector, according to the Ministry of Work, and continue to increase up to date. And of course, the Ministry of Work and the Council of Occupational Health issued a series of regulations to meet the teleworking situation, because we were wondering what do we need to apply. And the teleworkers were sent home to start teleworking, and other group of workers usually working physically at the company were received guidelines to conduct teleworking, and another third group were workers working not in fixed sites but normally are in the street. Or it also referred to people working with firemen and ambulances that do teleworking in that sector. and they are not in a specific place, but work in different areas. And last, they issued guidelines for people that face risk factors. For example, people with asthma, with cardiac diseases or diabetes. And as Dr. Garcia said, we generated a special bonus for all those people that had a reduction of hours of day work, and also implied a reduction of salary. And some others that were unemployed uh, receive a bonus, and those that have been reduced or stop the work receive another bonus. That is a bonus to protect, and represented an economic relief, represented $100 or 62,500 colones to all those people that reduce the day work in less than 60% of the normal day work, and around $60, that is 1,500 colones, that to people that were suspended in the labor contract, and also was given to informal workers, to the informal sector, and to all those people that were doing less day work, less than 50% of a normal day work. In these slides, you have the direct actions implemented to protect the different workers. A first guideline was issued together with the ILO, and that was health and security at work site to face COVID-19. The campaign was launched, and it was called Safe Place for Work. And it was especially rated all those workers that were put in working sites controlled and inspected by ministers of work. And that inspector inspected that that place were implemented the prevention COVID measures, and teleworking measures against COVID was implemented. And also, if they were teleworking, well adapted places, and to all those people that had been infected of COVID, it had to implement a strict guideline in their teleworking side, and both private and public companies sent many of their workers for teleworking, and that implied that they needed to be very serious on this topic. And they also issued a guideline to be implemented at public offices and for teleworking. So here you can see how since the first moment we consider in teleworking, it was a palliative measure for the crisis, and they start generating important conditions. This survey was conducted between June and July of 2020. We had at that time around 3 or 4 months after the emergency COVID declaration, and 93% of interviewed people were doing teleworking. 86% of that 93% was in teleworking. In the middle of crisis, many people had to work at home. And of course, there were a lot of advantages associated to teleworking. For example, our number of hours saved, conciliation between personal and labor lives, but also there were disadvantages. Disadvantages related to teleworking modality. For example, emotional disconnection, problems of internet disconnection, as it was already mentioned, and many face problems in the adaptation to that new modality of working. 74% of people and that were surveyed by the ministry were very happy of doing this teleworking, but in that survey generated also some doubts. For example, I saw that the workers needed to have tools to strengthen the emotion management and also to train them in the adaptation of emotions. For example, when many public servants and workers went home, well, then they implemented teleworking, and it was easy for them, the technological tools, as it happens in many countries.
We also have to mention the higher level of coordination with employers and guaranteeing employees to have the proper ergonomic and technological tools in order to do that telework. They also recommended the post-pandemic telework since June 2020 had to verify that people had the necessary conditions to telework. The law enacted in 2019 made it mandatory for employers to determine the conditions that teleworkers in telepositions had to have in order to carry out their activities. People who were working in bed or in their living room with lighting issues and that sort of things. And obviously, it called for the famous disconnection. By 2020, the IMSS Insurance Institute reported many claims, 13,000 claims of people suffering from COVID-19, out of which 11,948 were duly accepted as work risk and 1,191 were not accepted as labor risk. Now, this was because it was unsure whether people became infected at work or at home, and the risk factors in their everyday life. Main works affected were, as it was expected, police, traffic inspectors that represented 14%, nursing staff 9%, and domestic workers and personal service workers with 9% as well. Now, the claims for 2020 reported 2,272 diseases because of work, and you will see the diseases that were reported as work accidents in 2020 relation to COVID. Diseases caused by vibrations, by knee injuries, epicondylitis, diseases created because of extreme temperatures, what we call in our country thermic shock, which has a specific legislation, especially for agricultural workers and construction. There's a whole legislation issued at the government level and at the Ministry of Labor for thermal stress, chemical agents, and biological agents. Women, it just so happened, as you can see on this screen, had the most problems in regards to infectious and contagious diseases and dental diseases. Out of the 62 of HIV disease, 29% were men and 71% were women. And in regards to mental health, there's also a higher prevalence in women Out of the 33 cases of post-traumatic stress, 60% are women and 40% are men. It must be said that the consequences of COVID really, not just in health, but in general, and also in work, are about to be seen. We haven't come out of this problem. If you see the news, you'll know that in some European countries, stores are being closed, and there's a big discussion this week. There have even been protests and the like, which relate to the pandemic. Now, talking about legal regulations, normally, it is highly important to issue legal regulations. And in our case, we had a national policy for occupational health. We had an action policy for occupational health. We had a law, a regulation of that law, a guide for work risks and telework risks, but that doesn't guarantee anything. That doesn't guarantee anything because it rather relates to an issue of attitude in workers and in compliance of these rules and regulations by employers. So there are still some pending elements that we need to specify in this matter. The public institutions are focused in determining for the future, because we know that many people who did telework during the pandemic won't go back to their in-person jobs, but rather companies are transforming their positions. There's no problem with that because in our case, the law establishes a conversion contract going from in-person worker as teleworker. But there are still some important questions that Dr. San Juan mentioned: the confidentiality, the control, really. When you're working at home and there are legal limitations because of confidentiality and the privacy of your home, it's not the same thing to send a work inspector to an office than to your home to inspect a teleworker that is working in his or her home. So this is something that we will have to keep answering because unfortunately the inspection work is highly important when we're talking about these new concepts of work that is being created. That's why I was saying that while it is true that before the pandemic, we had to give a different vision to health and work health, now because of the new occupations and the new challenges that we had in labor law, that is incredibly important, and it's been discussed in many countries, the issue of Ubers, for example, whether they are work contracts or not, whether people are covered or not, and how can people be covered, and what are the conditions of these workers. And that is just but an example. We can talk about many other legislations. We think that in the coming years, we have to discuss what will be the functions that control agencies will have to implement on top of the regulations and standards that are essential. And we will also have to determine the actions, the real actions that we will have to have. We need to balance the command power, business command power, the right to our own image, the right for data protection, and the right for privacy of workers, together with the right to disconnect. And it's almost like a speech. It sounds very, very nice. And that's what we will have to focus on. The right to disconnect oneself has started to be discussed, and hopefully we'll have one regulation soon, which is the most important element that we can create today. And that will, of course, have an important role in the prevention efforts. So I think that I went a little over the time allotted for my presentation. I hope there are no consequences because of that. But I do believe that, as it was well said by the previous presenters, especially Dr. Corrales, there's a lot of work to be done on work risks and work health and worker health because of these things that we have faced. The COVID pandemic has created a series of challenges that we have to take head on. So once again, thank you very much. I am totally open to sharing this presentation. Some of this data, I can also share them in the presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Zuniga, for your presentation and the perspective that you have shared on the legislation in Costa Rica and the changes because of the pandemic. And your presentation allows us to see that despite having laws on telework, even before the pandemic, took everyone by surprise and has required all countries to sort of improvise to face the pandemic and maintain productive activities in operation. Because of the restricted amount of time, we have been reviewing the questions from the audience. We have a couple of people who have raised their hand, and so in the KPDT link, you can find my email there on that link, and you can send me your questions. If possible, I will answer that question, and if not, I will send it to our speakers. So just to wrap up and be on time, let me introduce Dr. Irma Juarez Perez. She is part of our Inter-American Center for Social Security Studies. She has a degree on stomatology by the Autonomous University of the State of Mexico. She has a master's degree in work health by the Work Health Institute, and she has a PhD in high management by the State of Mexico Postgraduate Center. She has very many diploma courses on education, focusing on a comprehensive focus for work management and managing work health, planning, and high management while addressing health services. She has the quality auditor certification in management systems and leadership. She has coordinated work security at the Mexican Institute of Social Security, and she has taught at the Postgraduate Center in the State of Mexico. She currently coordinates the Inter-American Center on Social Security Studies. You have the floor, Doctor. Thank you very much. Your microphone is muted.
Sí, tenemos problemas para escucharla, ¿no?
We are having some issues hearing you.
No la escuchamos, doctora.
We can't hear you, doctor.
Si desconecta sus audífonos, doctora, tal vez.
Maybe if you try disconnecting your headsets. Okay. Can you hear me now? Great. Well, after this kind introduction and generous introduction by the doctor, I'd like to say that this webinar has been quite enriching. We have expert preventionists from 3 countries who have shared a background and a mapping of their countries. And from the introduction by Dr. Hill, we now have the overview of the social work environment before the pandemic and after the pandemic. So that is why we have a volatile world, uncertain world that is complex and ambiguous. And therefore, the specialist preventionist face a big challenge because companies care about productivity, but preventionists care about reaching that productivity and profitability with a healthy work environment, healthy companies and productive companies, therefore. And these companies will achieve this healthy status through a healthy workforce. We saw that if the world is wrapped around this volatility and uncertainty, American countries and Caribbean countries are even more wrapped around volatility. Preventionists and experts in all support areas for occupational health during the decision taking, a reaction had to be taken because we weren't prepared for the pandemic, and that happened around the world. As experts and preventionists, we now have the need to view towards the future. That is, if this is cyclical, what will we learn from the pandemic? We will have to plan prospectively and setting off from all these experiences that you have shared today, which have been very enriching, because we have, for example, the case of Argentina, where Dr. Claudio stressed that telework has been a way to push forward with this new way of working. And we know that this teleworking was born in 1970, formally, the United States and Europe, because of the environmental needs. So we see here this need right now, and as Dr. Francis Zúñiga mentioned, we have the need to see the advantages and disadvantages. And now we can see that it is precise to have a mixed work, not entirely in person, not entirely virtual, because we have these pros and cons. We need a mixed work. That is the experience of that the pandemic has given us. Therefore, it is timely to envision this in that direction. Dr. Claudio also mentioned that it is possible to have some sort of violence because of telework, because this has made workers and employers to invade the individuality of workers while they are teleworking. Work hours are being surpassed. They are not having proper rest. We are exceeding work days, and we still might have the mindset of because people are home, they are not being productive, as Dr. Claudio mentioned. The doctor also mentioned that talking about psychosocial factors, everything starts from the perception because perception will give us emotions and emotions will give us attitudes. And from that, we see an increase of all psychosomatic diseases. Chronic and degenerative diseases are increasing. And we foresee that in 10 years, we'll be able to assess this consequence in the psychosocial order. So as preventionists, the support that we can give work systems is highly important. We cannot have a healthy environment if we don't care for workers from the start. So that is why I am very pleased to share this panel with you. Dr. Garcia, who I salute, shared that in the Dominican Republic, they also closed borders and applied drastic measures that were permanent, and they virtualized training. They virtualized training in order to avoid infections. Health measures were strict in their compliance. And the doctor also mentioned something very important, the fact that in the Dominican Republic, they were able to cover small and medium businesses and larger companies, and they gradually open their activities again to achieve operational status. Dr. Francis also mentioned that Costa Rica has faced many crises, at least 10 crises, and they have applied national strategies for emergencies who have given them impactful results, which he shared with the high management diploma course graduates. And everyone agreed. Our brothers and sisters from Costa Rica has given us these lessons about how they have faced things. Dr. Francis also mentioned that chronic diseases in his country have increased, and as preventionists, this is a relevant point. We need to go to the root cause of these problems. We have this pandemic, but we need to envision the post-pandemic in which we won't have the same workers. Before the pandemic, we had a work base, but now in the pandemic, we have personnel that is resilient, but there are many reactions in the workers. Workers need to be taken into consideration, and that way be included in all preventive measures that can be issued both by companies and by the general society. Dr. Francis also mentioned that they reacted and issued guidelines on the declaration of emergency. That is, the normalization in his country had to be dynamic, as in all other places, but he shared that they had to adapt to this need, and at least 63,000 people were teleworking in the public sector, and that has increased since then, which stresses the fact that telework is a reality in all countries. We can't go back and roll back everything that was implemented in this pandemic because it has given us a lot of benefits. I would also like to stress, as the last part of this important webinar, that during the pandemic, we require occupational health. Without occupational health, the economy would be paralyzed. So it is highly important to hear preventionists. Damage control is important, but we're seeing that preventionists are the ones that impact to avoid damages. I would like to stress a quote by Einstein, and it's applicable for you, preventionists, and for everyone really in the panel and in the audience. Dr. Gil Rivas is also a preventionist. Intellectuals resolve problems, but geniuses prevent them. That is, you as preventionists are in the battlefield day by day, preventing the occurrence of work risks, diseases, or risks, and from the root cause through a timely diagnosis, you and your expertise will prevent that incidence in work risks, and therefore you're contributing to your country, society, and the country and the Americas and the Caribbean. I would like to express my appreciation for you. I'm a true believer that without prevention, we can't manage anything. So you have all my acknowledgement for your work, because having healthy workers is good for societies. You as preventionists are providing all the possible support for your societies and countries. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Doctor, for your excellent closing remarks. I will give the floor to our chairperson, Dr. Graciela Gil. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the brilliant presenters for the excellent summaries in each one of their presentations. Dr. Claudio San Juan, Francis Zúñiga, Dr. Mercedes Garcia. I think that this is the scenario that, supported by CS, has been said, and we have the expectation of having the scope of reaching all preventionists. We mentioned that this is the time for experts in work health. The Commission for Work Health Prevention offers its microsite, as it was mentioned, where we will welcome all the comments to reflect and improve. Our commitment is with the prevention of work risks in all our member countries. And we also have the commitment to training and prevention, focusing on healthy companies, because despite the pandemic, we're undergoing an era of business transformation. We would like to stress that preventionists in all areas, we're indebted with you at the Commission. Please visit our site and please join us in our other events. Thank you so much for your participation. We hope we fulfilled your expectations. Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to our presenters. Good afternoon.